This is Still Enrolled.
And welcome on into the latest edition of Still Enrolled, a Big Ten football podcast. As always, Brian Hickey, Brian Tripp with you here on a big week 8 in the Big Ten. We are so excited. We have a really fun podcast for you here. Nebraska, Indiana, big matchup. We have another top 25 matchup as well in the Big Ten. We have some really good games that we'll break down. Zach Osterman of the IndyStar will also join us as well here, kind of break down that game and give us so far his thoughts on Curt Cignetti changing the culture at IU. A lot of questions. He will give us some answers there as well. But Tripp, not only do we have a big week 8 here in the Big Ten, we're also at the midway point of the season. It's I don't know how we're here. It feels like we just started the pod yesterday, and here we are halfway home of this 2024 season.
Yeah, we need to go back and count how many episodes that we've done so far. And we kind of batted around ideas this week, right? Like, did we want to do report cards for each team? Did we want to rank teams in different tiers? And we'll have a couple of awards that we're going to give out. But the question was, like, what do we do to talk and hit that reset button? You said, like, still a decent schedule this week. And I know we're going to hit a lot on Indiana. But hit that reset button and feel like where we're at in the Big Ten. And I have a couple of major takeaways, and I think this is a week where the top teams, Oregon, Penn State, and Ohio State, and Indiana, let's put Indiana in that group. We'll talk about if they're justified to be in that mix or not. But this is a week because of what's happening elsewhere in college football. The national landscape is more going to be dictated by what happens between Texas and Georgia in a top 5 matchup. Alabama or Tennessee is getting their second loss this week. Iowa State against UCF, Clemson, Virginia, Notre Dame, Georgia Tech, Miami at Louisville. Like, there's some other big games this week that I think will determine more in terms of playoff than perhaps we'll see in the Big Ten outside of the IU Nebraska game. But this is a good week now that we had the big week last week to hit that reset button and see where we sit.
You're right. And so, like I said, we kicked around ideas because, like, we don't want to be corny with it, to be honest. Like, we want to be able to, like, give you good insight without kind of being cheesy and, like, dragging through it. So we came to the decision, you came to the decision, Tripp. You guided us here. You get the credit here of just simplifying and saying, what the hell do we learn? Look back the first 7 weeks of the season, 6 games played. What the hell did we learn? So, Tripp, I'll throw to you here, all-encompassing question. Halfway through the year in the Big Ten, what did we learn?
I think that there's so much parity at the middle of the conference and the margin separating. And I'm not saying Ohio State, Oregon, Penn State. And again, Indiana's still like, where are we at? Where do we sit with this team? How good could they really be? They've done nothing but prove to us so far that they've been dominant. But the margin between teams maybe 4, 5, and 6 and teams 13, 14, 15 really isn't all that big. And it's weird too, because Michigan and Washington played in the national championship game last year. So do I think that for them to make the jump back into true title contenders is a big one? No, but they're not there this year. So I think you have a Big Ten that has 3, maybe 4 great teams that are true playoff contenders and national championship contenders. And then a whole bunch of other teams that are pretty good, but the margin between win and loss on any given week, and then also some Jekyll and Hyde so far from an Iowa, from a Washington, from a Wisconsin. Like, there's so many teams that I just don't know what to make of. And maybe that's because that is truly who they are this year in the Big Ten.
I think that idea and philosophy kind of also goes to all of college football with some of the upsets we've seen recently. Like, this is maybe the most open college football season we've seen in 15, 20 years. And I think that's like, there's a lot of concern of what NIL, the transfer portal, will do. And you're seeing it right now in the Big Ten directly. It has made, I think, the bottom teams more competitive to where, like you said, like, I don't think going forward there's for the most part here, a guaranteed win in any way schedule. I mean, we saw last week the 2 worst teams in the conference in Purdue and UCLA lose either in overtime in the last play or in the last 30 seconds. Now, again, you're not playing the best teams in the conference, but there's like we have seen plenty of times a layup game for some of these schools. And now maybe, okay, fine. Penn State, Oregon, and Ohio State's in a different conversation. But like everybody else, 4 through 18, there's no such thing as an easy game, a layup whatsoever. I think it's great for the conference because you're seeing the overall health to where you could truly believe your team can be competitive on a week in and week out basis.
You made a really interesting point there, and I'm going to step away from the Big Ten to prove this example. And obviously, all the national talk right now has been about Vanderbilt. Well, when you bring in a transfer quarterback, Alabama's loss to Vanderbilt no longer looks like that bad of a loss. Is it a great loss? No, but it doesn't look like your traditional Alabama-Vanderbilt game. There are different ways, and we've seen it with Curt Cignetti at Indiana this year. There are different ways to build programs, right? Your Ohio States, Oregons, Penn States, Michigans of the Big Ten are always going to be built. The foundation is always going to be built on guys who are going to be 3 or 4 year players in your program, who are going to be 5-4 or upper echelon 3-star recruits. And you're going to have the pick of the litter. Then those programs, to fill holes, will go and poach players from other mid-tier or even other Power 4 conference teams to fill their voids, to fill holes. Now, a team like an Indiana, a Purdue, a Vanderbilt, they're going to find their guy, and they could build their team. Not that they can't do it the other way, but they can build a team around a portal pickup or someone that is influenced by NIL to come to an institution. And then that can be the difference maker for their program. I get it that Will Howard and Dylan Gabriel are both transfer starting quarterbacks on 2 of the top 3 teams in the Big Ten, but they were filling a void. Actually, they weren't just filling a void, they're enhancing, right? Ohio State easily could have run it back to Kyle McCord, and Kyle McCord's had a heck of a season at Syracuse.
Yes.
But they felt like there was the ability to improve there. Meanwhile, if you're Indiana, it's like, well, who the heck are we going to throw out there? Curtis Rourke isn't the ability to improve. Curtis Rourke is a guy we desperately need through the portal. Kenneth Walker was a guy that Mel Tucker desperately needed through the portal. And that's why Michigan State was really good in that 1 year under Mel Tucker before things went crazy there. So these teams, we're seeing different ways to build teams and different ways to be successful. I still think the way to long-term sustained consistent success is to do it through recruiting and then amplify that by success in the portal. And that's what's going to allow those upper echelon teams to stay upper echelon teams. However, you can have a Vanderbilt year or an Indiana year and then hope to, rise your program to that next level. And I think that's what we're seeing play out.
I think too, like to your point, like those programs, Vanderbilt, maybe Indiana will see their staying power here, but a lot of those programs, right, that were kind of like they needed the perfect storm to compete. Recruiting classes, guys come in. Now you still need that. Like I don't think they'll be year in, year out 9, 10, 11 win programs, but the quick fix or the perfect storm can happen a lot quicker now in the transfer portal, where you can maybe instead of once every 5 years, it could be once every 3 years or twice every 5 years because you can reload. And if you hit, like you said, on great transfers, especially to poor positions, you can really take off very, very quickly. And we've seen that, like you said, with Vanderbilt and Indiana, 2 of the best stories. I would argue right now, Indiana, the best story in all of college football so far this season, which leads me to this question, Trip, so far. Biggest surprise, in your opinion, so far through the first 7 weeks of the season? Good or bad?
Yeah, I think Indiana obviously is the biggest surprise with their success and how dominant they've been so far to this point. We're going to talk a lot about their matchup with Nebraska, but they've had 4 games of 500 plus yards of total offense. They've scored first in every game. They're one of 2 teams in college football that haven't trailed. You can talk about Curtis Rourke. You can talk about Aiden Fisher. Mikael Kamara on that defensive line has 5 sacks. Like, this is a well-rounded team offensively and defensively. It's really easy to point to them as the biggest surprise. We've talked so much about positives and Oregon's win over Ohio State and how good Ohio State has looked, even though they had 1 hiccup on the road, a 1-point game, really a 1-play game, that all of a sudden that national narrative of Ohio State again losing a big game doesn't exist. Maybe 1 call goes their way and that narrative doesn't exist. I think Penn State's, like, we've talked about the positives. The other surprise to me, it's kind of on the flip side, and we probably haven't talked about it enough, is I think Michigan, you know, they've they've struggled more than I thought they would with being one-dimensional, and you look at their schedule the rest of the way to still have what they have upcoming. This is a team that could be a 5-6 loss team at the end of the season. I think USC to have lost again the same as last year, one score, two score games, and not finding a way to get it done. They have talent, USC. Obviously, I saw it on display firsthand last weekend. But for them to struggle the way that they have at winning games, Rutgers the last 2 weeks, like what the heck happened? Iowa still sitting in an okay spot, but to really have no semblance of a passing game again this year, to me, there's more surprises on the negative side than maybe the positive side for a lot of these programs where Indiana, the big three, Ohio State, Oregon, Penn State coming into the year. Nebraska, they've kind of lived up to the hype. I know they've won lots, but they kind of lived up to the hype. But it's the other side, like what's going on with those teams? And to me, where do they go with those programs the rest of the year? And like, does USC end with 5 or 6 losses? Does Michigan end with 5 or 6 losses? That's the surprise to me.
To push back on Michigan, I guess, like, is it a surprise? Like, is it a surprise, or is it were a lot of people blinded maybe by the brand, them coming off a national title, and their preseason rank, which I believe was 8. I know they're a top 10 team for sure. I believe the number was 8. Like, was it that, like the preseason hype? Because like you look at what they lost, you look at the quarterback situation that was never solidified, even going into, like, we had no idea who was going to start until literally the offense came out. Like, even with those questions, you're still surprised with how this season has gone?
With Davis Warren and Alex Orji, they haven't had a 100-yard passing game since September 14th.
It's not bad.
This is it's still, I don't think anyone, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but to be that inept in the passing game, to struggle the way they have in the secondary, to still have 3 or 4 first-round NFL draft picks on your current roster, and to have looked as average, as one-dimensional as they have had this year, that's what's – you still have Colston Loveland.
Right.
They still have some weapons. Donovan Edwards, he was going to be the star this season. Well, Mullings has been the guy at running back. I think they've really – again, I think there was the expectation that this was going to be a retooling, rebuilding year. But how they've looked, they're still sitting at 4-2. But how they've looked to get there, it has not. A lot of their wins it's not like they've been convincing.
No, you're right about that. I guess maybe I'm not personally that surprised how this season has gone with Michigan, just with all the questions. But to a positive, at least in terms of a surprise here, how about Illinois as well?
Yeah,
with them right now sitting as a top 25 team. Luke Ormiller has played really well. So, I mean, he's the most in terms of touchdown interception ratio, 14-1. He has the best touchdown interception ratio in all of college football. He's been tremendous holding on to the ball and not turning it over. Obviously, he's found his guys in Zachary Franklin and Pat Bryant a lot. Like,
yep.
I don't know, but I did not expect Illinois to be as proficient through the air as they've been this season. That's
the thing to me. Like, Brett Bielema, I think, has proven that last year was kind of an anomaly for them. And this is what they've been. And they've won a lot, right? They're 2-0 in overtime. I think they're 3-0 in one-score games. So they've won tight games. So you do need a little bit of luck to go your way. In that, like, who's to say last week Purdue doesn't throw a touchdown pass or a 2-point conversion and complete the pass, and all of a sudden your perception of Illinois is a little bit different right now, and they're out of the top 25. That said, how they've done it, for Altmaier to make a complete 180, not turn the ball over, to have 2 big-time wide receiver threats, how they've done it is impressive to me. Now, they're still a bit one-dimensional, and like, they're a team that this is what we are, this is what we're going to rely upon, and we're not going to blow anybody out. But they have been a real pleasant surprise. And we'll have to go back and look at, like, our picks from early in the year, where we established win totals for each team, because Illinois, I think, is on the precipice of already surpassing the totals that we outlined for them. I believe we were both around the 6-win mark. Like, I think we said bowl eligibility, but
nowhere near the potential where you look at their schedule, right? They play Michigan this week and they're a home dog. We'll get to that pick a little bit later on in the show. But if you can win that game, you're at Oregon next week, probably loss, but you finish at home against Minnesota, Michigan State, at Rutgers, at Northwestern. You will be favored or have a chance in all 4 of those games. If you take care of business, again, it's a big if. I feel confident saying we could be talking about a 9-3 Illinois team, maybe 10-2, which even at 9-3, I did not see that coming. That's been a tremendous year so far for the Illini. They have really so far impressed and surprised, I think.
This is a huge week for them because Illinois and Michigan, and again, like what's at stake, probably a berth in a better bowl game, but like they're jockeying for that middle tier of the Big Ten. Michigan still has to play Oregon, at Indiana, and at Ohio State. Like if they don't beat Illinois, again, you're looking at a 6-loss potentially Michigan team. And again, I don't know that anyone thought that they would fall that far with the returning talent that they have. And they beat USC. Imagine if they didn't find a way to beat USC on a 4th and goal to take it in and beat them on the final drive of the game. That's kind of their story.
That's a good point. You're right. They are one. We talk about being, USC 1, 2, 3 plays away from 5-1, 6-0. Michigan's 1 play away from, like you said, really having this season be disastrous. They miss a bowl game completely. It's that for sure. Like you said, it's definitely right now not how a lot of people saw this season going. What about conference MVP? Halfway through the year, who has been the MVP trip in your mind?
Yeah, there's a couple to pick from here, and I think our top 3, top 4 is probably the same, but I'm going to go with Curtis Rourke. 1,700 passing yards, 14 touchdowns, 2 picks, and how dominant Indiana has been. Curtis Rourke's my MVP.
I'll go Dylan Gabriel, in part because we saw him on a big stage, right? Even though the run game is getting better for Oregon each week, I mean, they won that game in part because not only his arm, but also his legs as well. They've put a lot of the load on him for success, and he's delivered. I mean, he's been tremendous so far, leading the conference in passing, second in passing touchdowns at 13. Outside of, again, a 2-week stretch here, he's done a good job of keeping the ball out of the opponent's hands. And just, I think with what Oregon has asked him to do so far this season and him delivering, again, especially on the biggest stage you could possibly have last week against Ohio State, I think through 6 weeks or 7 weeks, give me Dylan Gabriel, conference MVP. But he is, Curtis Rourke, I think is right there. Like, again, you look at players making an impact. There's been a lot of impressive players so far in the Big Ten.
Yeah, like also on my list, top 5, I'd have Caleb Johnson from Iowa, Tyler Warren from Penn State. And then it's so hard to pick. Like for Ohio State, you just go with Howard because he's kind of the puppeteer of that offense. But you have 2 running backs with over 400 yards. You have 2 receivers with over 500 yards and 6 touchdowns. So like for Ohio State, you can pick anyone on that offense. But I guess Howard because he's the puppeteer of the whole thing. All right, let's wrap this discussion up. Like coach of the year, we both are going to pick Curt Cignetti. You have honorable mention Brett Bielema. I have honorable mention James Franklin. I think he's done an unbelievable job with Penn State this year. But is Indiana, because we want to get to Zach Osterman from the IndyStar here, but is Indiana a real playoff threat? Like, I think that they're the big story. They're the unknown. Are they a part of that upper tier? Like, their success determines how good the Big Ten is this year. Are they a real playoff threat? You have the stat on the screen for those of our audience watching on YouTube. IU has a 99% chance to make the college football playoff if they go 11-1 and don't make the Big Ten title game. 92% if they go 11-1 and make it to Indy. They've got Nebraska, they've got Washington, they've got Michigan, they've got Ohio State. We're going to find out. It's going to play itself out. But, we need something to talk about here. Are they a playoff threat?
Forget a playoff threat. I think they're in. I think they're making the playoff. I really like what I've seen so far from Indiana in terms of how they handle business. I think the schedule, even though it does uptick here, I think it is very manageable going forward. They'll be favored again in every game except Ohio State. I think the one thing you can't do is get blown out by Ohio State. Again, I think 11-1, you saw the numbers there, you should be good. But if you lose 52-3, that could take a little bit of hit here. I don't think they will, but that's the only kind of thing I am worried about. But I think they will take care of business. They've given you no reason right now to doubt that. And you look around the rest of college football, there are not many teams I feel better about than Indiana. Like Ole Miss right now, Mizzou, like a lot of teams we thought in other conferences that could take up playoff spots are simply losing or not performing well. I think Indiana, forget threat. I think they're making the playoff when it's all said and done.
I think it comes down ultimately to the perception of the Big Ten at the end of the year compared to the SEC and how many spots are available. I'm not ready to make that leap. I think they've been dominant. They've been great. I think this weekend's a toss up, but they win it. It's still, to me, I'm going to keep coming back. Like, it's still Indiana football. As good as they may be, I can't take that leap and say they're going to run the table or even go 11-1 because it's still, until I'm proven otherwise, and they've done nothing but prove it so far this season, it's still Indiana football. And at what point does having players from MAC, JMU catch up to you against the big teams, the good teams in the Big Ten? And I'm even going to put Washington and Michigan in that group, despite everything we just said about those programs, because of the national championship caliber players that they still have on the roster. And I'm not ready to say Indiana, like, if they're going to win some of those games, they're going to have to win close games. They are not going to blow everybody out. I'm not ready to take that leap to say they win every close game. They need a little luck on their side.
All right, to get more thoughts on that, to really talk about if Indiana is a true playoff contender and now preview their game against Nebraska as well coming up this weekend, Zach Osterman will join us next year, give us all the breakdown on IU football. Zach is next. And welcome back in. Ryan Hickey, Brian Tripp with right here on the Still Enrolled podcast. Let's welcome onto the show Zach Osterman. Does a tremendous job covering IU for the IndyStar. Zach, it's been a hell of a season so far. Thanks so much for giving us a few minutes here.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me.
So we were talking before you came on, Zach, about, kind of doing a conference in review so far since we're at the midway point of the season. And we both called Indiana the biggest surprise so far in the Big Ten this season. 6-0, nationally ranked. Curt Cignetti's really taken over this program and taken over college football, if you will. What has led to this point? Like, what has he done so far? So we're sitting here talking about Indiana truly having a chance to make the college football playoff at the end of the year.
Yeah, I don't think – when I say I'm not super surprised Indiana's 6-0. I mean, I went back and looked at my preseason projections. I picked them to go 5-1. I actually wanted to pick them to start 6-0, and another relatively jaded ex-IU beat writer sort of said, "Hey, man, we've both covered enough IU football to know not to get out over anybody's skis." But one way or the other, you looked at the way those first 6 games shaped up, who they played, where they played them, when they played them, frankly. And you felt like Indiana actually had a pretty good chance of winning, virtually all those games. It's more, I think, the way Indiana's done it. And there have been the sort of the eye-popping numbers, 5 straight games of 40-plus points, first time in program history. Obviously, one of the best offenses in the Big Ten. I would argue probably the best red zone team in the country. Curtis Rourke has looked really good. The defense has maybe not been quite at the level the offense has, but it has certainly taken on the same sort of identity that Brian Haynes' defenses had a lot of success with at James Madison, the aggressiveness, the downhill nature, the disruptive plays, things like that. But even if you kind of dig a level deeper, I mean, like I've told people over these first few weeks, I've probably covered more explosive Indiana offenses. I don't think I've ever covered one anywhere near this efficient. When you look at their red zone numbers, their third down numbers, how good they are, individual players are in red zone situations or third down situations or short yardage situations. The pass game is obviously more statistically productive than the run game, and that is historically kind of what Curt Cignetti's offenses look like. But you look at that run game's productivity in short yardage, in third and fourth downs, in, goal-to-go situations and things like that. Mm-hmm. It is just a team that is maximizing creating a ton of opportunities for itself and maximizing virtually every one of those. And, yes, the schedule is going to get harder from here. And, is Indiana going to win 11 games? I'm not sure I'm ready to go that far. But you just look at what they have done to the teams they have played. And it is hard to feel like this team isn't, at very least, kind of firmly in that, best of the rest group. And I guess what we find out in the next few weeks is are they even a little bit better than I think they are?
Zach, take me back to August, early September, before Indiana plays an actual game. And, Curt's putting this thing together, and obviously all the JMU connections that he brings with him. And he's won everywhere he's gone. People are comparing him now to Kalen DeBoer. And, identifying a quarterback who was good at his previous stop in the MAC, but, not a quarterback that every major program coveted. He's not Will Howard. He's not Dylan Gabriel. How did he put this together to the point where this is what, like we talked earlier about building programs today? And because of the portal, Indiana has to figure out a way to build a program probably a little bit differently than an Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, Oregon does. How was he able to put this together? And does it surprise you, how he was able to put it together and how it's played out?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say is Indiana has, Indiana's not going to have the NIL resources of a place like Ohio State or Oregon, but it has really kind of doubled or even tripled down in the last 12 months on its ability to fundraise there. Indiana was at, I think, a little over 1.5 a year ago. I know that when they made the coaching change, we were able to confirm they had gotten that number up past 3. I think they've more than doubled that since then. And a lot of that, listen, NIL, like anything else, is going to reflect the energy and the excitement around your program. If Curt Cignetti was 2-4 right now, maybe they're not doing so well. But that's what success breeds success. And I think when you ask how he did it, I think there's a lot of different answers to that. And I wrote something almost just kind of summing up a lot of conversations we've had with Cignetti, with his players this week, kind of basically trying to answer that same question. I think obviously really good identification of talent in the portal. Also, as much as you can sort of quantify this, makeup, composure, intangibles, a guy like Curtis Rourke, for example, who, instead of maybe looking at, Indiana is almost like kind of a free year of college, looks at it as, hey, this is my chance to go prove myself. I've done it. I've proven it everywhere I can except the Big Ten level. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to go show everybody that that's the kind of quarterback I am. I think there's been, people like me, have made a lot out of the productivity of the JMU transfers. And I think that's relevant, obviously, statistically. But I also think there's something, and I don't know exactly how, and I've been trying to figure out a way to kind of like, spell this out, like write this essentially into something I wrote. And I haven't yet. But it's almost kind of this idea that, you brought all these players from this place where obviously Curt Cignetti had won a ton of games. And you had players kind of across the map in terms of, Mikel Kamara was a really unheralded high school recruit who I think even Curt Cignetti wasn't sure he wanted to offer a scholarship. And I think it might have been either Bryant Haynes or Pat Kuntz that was like, we need to, like, believe me, we need this guy. James Carpenter was a walk-on who eventually earned his way onto scholarship. Elijah Surratt was actually a transfer last year. He started at St. Francis 2 years ago and then came up to James Madison last season, had an all-conference season, and then came to IU. The point is you got a lot of guys who've taken different journeys. And you can sort of say, oh, all these guys have punched up and they've proven, they've sort of outstretched expectations or whatever. But the one constant is everywhere they go, it seems like, and they're always obviously with Curt Cignetti, it seems like this culture follows that just finds success and just sort of breeds success. And all off season, we heard both those transfers and also their new teammates talk about, well, these guys, they vouch for what Cignetti does. They vouch for what, for the schemes, for the assistants, for, the approach and the, sort of the methods. And again, I haven't really found a way to distill this down into something that makes sense in my own mind. So forgive me, I'm kind of rambling into it here. But it's kind of this idea that if you have all these players that come from a previous program where all they talk about is winning culture and this was the way we did it and this was how we developed, this is how we were better than all these, all of our peers, and then they come up to this level and it still works, then you do feel like it's got to be more than just the scheme is clever or, this one guy is outperforming expectations relative to his recruiting ranking or whatever. It's something more broad, something that really covers more of the program that Curt Cignetti can just put together. And, I think Indiana, when it went into the hiring process, it wanted a head coach with a lot of experience. It did not want a young assistant. It did not want somebody who was going to have to come in and sort of learn how to do the job, on the fly. One of Scott Dolson's EAD, one of Scott Dolson's priorities was a head coach with a career winning record and a lot of years on the job. And the reason was because Indiana wanted something like this. It wanted someone that could walk in right away and have like a process and a, for lack of something less cliche, a culture that could immediately be translated into the locker room. And again, did anyone expect maybe this 6-0 and the way they've played and all that? I think probably not. But I think the reason there was belief and excitement around Curt Cignetti pretty much from December of last year up until the start of this season was because everybody felt like they'd found someone who could deliver what they were looking for.
You say culture, Zach, right? Obviously, that starts with the head coach in Curt Cignetti, and he's confident, right? But most college football coaches are confident in what they can do. But he's different in the sense of he's outwardly confident. He's not afraid to tell you how confident he is. There's plenty of sound clips all over the internet displaying his confidence in what he's done in the past and obviously what he thinks his team will do. I'm just like on a day-to-day basis here, we don't really see coaches talk the way Cignetti talks. What has it been like being around his personality, covering the personality? How much has that impacted right now Indiana's early season success?
Oh, I mean, I think it is substantial. And I think, number one, you're allowed to be that confident when you've had the success that he's had. And I think, one thing that he said very early on in his time at IU was he said part of the reason the job appealed to him was because he felt like he'd done it before, that he'd gone to places where, for whatever reason, I think Elon is a pretty good example, as somebody who, grew up in the South and whose father was a Georgia Southern alum. So I used to watch a lot of old Southern Conference football. Elon is not a dissimilar sort of challenge at that level to what Indiana is at the FBS level. But I think even taking James Madison up from the FCS to the Sun Belt and all those different things, he said, I felt like I'd kind of been to places that needed, to sort of prove certain expectations wrong, that needed he uses the word culture change or the phrase culture change a lot. I think he's earned the right to the confidence that he has. I think it rubs off on his players. I mean, to a man, they'll tell you that, their confidence starts with his confidence. I think every once in a while he'll admit he is just being playful. I think sometimes he is and sometimes he's not. I think when he said "Google me, I win," I don't think he was cracking a joke there. But I think when he, there's also, he said it at Big Ten Media Day. He said sometimes we're in the entertainment business. Sometimes we need to get up and entertain. So when he grabbed the microphone at that Maryland game last year and made the comments that he made about Purdue and Michigan and Ohio State, I think there was a point behind it, but I think there was also a sense of like, hey, let's just get people fired up. There's no harm in that, essentially. But what I come back to is he has earned the right to the confidence that I think he has. And I think it also probably helps him too, how much of his staff he's kept together. So, the offense is his, but he's also got 4 coaches on the offensive side, using that as the example, that have been with him for a long time, that know how he works. He knows how they work. A head coach will tell you that if a coach's job is to put players in the best possible position to succeed, it's also a coach's job to do the exact same thing with his assistants. I think, Curt Cignetti's got a good feel for his staff as well. And so I think, again, like it just very early on, all of that sort of bled out into all the other areas around the program, the roster, the administration, whatever. And in whatever sort of you needed it, if you were Indiana to sort of affect things positively, it did. I talked to Mike Kadick, who's been an offensive lineman at IU for, I guess this is his 6th season, if I'm not mistaken, because he's using his COVID year. And this was back at Media Days. He talked about Cignetti's first team-wide meeting. I think it was in January because, the time he was hired, everything was kind of hectic and whatever. But he basically said, there are some of you in here that aren't going to be able to help us win, and you're probably going to have to move on. But the ones that are here, I'm a winner. I'm here to win. I'm not here to win in 3 years. I'm not here to win when I get my own players. I'm here to win right now. I think we can win right now. We've built a roster that we can win with right now. And if you want to be a part of that, then, we'll bring you with us. And Katie basically said that just got the whole room on side right away, because it was sort of saying to a bunch of players who obviously had spent a lot of time struggling, the last 2-3 years for relevance, for success. It told them, here's a brand new coach who doesn't know much about me, but he clearly already believes in me. So maybe I need to believe in him. And the more that belief is repaid, Cignetti also talks kind of about this virtuous circle of confidence and success. The more you have, the more you realize, the more you realize, the more you have, and it just becomes something that kind of self-feeds.
For any talk of a playoff, which is, I know, so far-fetched to think from the beginning of the year, but here we are. They have to beat Nebraska, and Nebraska brings a defense that is 7th in scoring. We've seen what they've done this year. They played an okay schedule, right? Not like a great schedule of opponents, but this is a good Nebraska defense. What do they have to do this week against Nebraska? And then as it continues to play out, like, is the talk of a potential playoff justified?
Yeah, I think to the Nebraska question first, I think a lot of it, at least on paper, and how often do these things devolve into something we don't expect, but at least on paper, I think a lot of it is managing that defense. Again, if you talk about what has made Indiana so good offensively, to me, it's not the explosive plays, it's the efficiency. Indiana's been great on third downs. Indiana's only committed 4 turnovers all year. All 4 of those were against Maryland in, the remnants of a hurricane. And I think if you go 5 games with 0 turnovers and 1 game with 4, you're allowed to say, hey, maybe some of that 1 game with 4 was a rain game situation. Indiana has, I think Curtis Rourke, has only taken 5 sacks all season. Indiana has been really good in limiting tackles for loss and things like that. My point is, Indiana has been really good at all the things that keep an offense on schedule, that keep an offense out of dangerous situations, obvious passing downs, 3rd and long situations. Nebraska is going to be the biggest challenge Indiana's faced to this point in terms of dealing with, I guess what we now have taken to call havoc plays, negative plays, turnovers, tackles for loss, sacks, stuff that moves an offense back. Obviously, the other question is about Nebraska offensively, and I am sort of fascinated to see what both of these teams have done during the bye week, because you would imagine that Matt Rule probably always looked at that bye week. Nebraska got it after 6 weeks too, as a nice sort of reset moment for Dylan Raiola. And does Nebraska maybe come out of the bye week having taken him a couple steps forward as a quarterback? He's been good, but the offense has kind of been uneven in its production. Have they maybe found some things that they really kind of polished during the bye week that Indiana's got to adjust to? On the other hand, Indiana's defense has had, I would say was a little shakier against Northwestern, was a little shakier against Maryland than it had been, for example, against UCLA. Has it maybe corrected some things, gotten a little healthier in some areas, gotten a little bit sharper in some areas? But the obvious matchup on paper here is, can Indiana manage a defense that is both as stingy and as disruptive as any it's faced, and maybe any it will face, other than, I guess, maybe Ohio State, possibly Michigan. But I wouldn't be shocked if we get to the end of the season and Nebraska's right up there with the best in the Big Ten in a lot of these areas. Can Indiana stay on schedule and keep scoring points through that? Because this is the kind of game where you feel like if Indiana breaks 30 points, you'd be kind of surprised if Indiana lost. But if Indiana gets held under a certain number, maybe 25, then that probably tilts things much more toward Nebraska's favor. So as to the playoff thing, to me, these next 2 games are really important. Like maybe even these next 3, if you want to loop in the Michigan State game, because it sort of feels like we've seen Indiana now separate itself from the bottom of the conference. From the teams that are going to be fighting just to get to be bowl eligible. Now you're going to play a 5-1 Nebraska team. And then what is Washington? I think 4-3, if I'm not mistaken, or 4-2. a couple teams that are really good at some of what they do. Nebraska defensively, Washington offensively. Washington's got a quarter, maybe the other most experienced quarterback in the conference alongside Curtis Rourke. Maybe, I guess, Dylan Gabriel certainly up there as well. Both these games are at home, and then Michigan State is a rivalry game on the road. We'll kind of see where Michigan State is. They're going to be coming off a brutal stretch in October. But this is where I think Indiana sort of, if Indiana comes through these next two games 8-0, and especially if it comes through these next three games 9-0, then you don't just say Indiana sort of put the bottom of the conference in the rear view. You sort of are allowed to say, I think anyway, that Indiana's put the middle of the conference in the rear view. And at that point, too, if we are still having the playoff conversation around Indiana in 3 weeks, Indiana can start pointing to some quality wins. Because at this point, I think in all likelihood, Indiana's probably beaten at most one bowl team in the first 6 weeks. It's going to have to beat some better opponents if it's going to, factor into the committee's thinking, even in like a 10, 11, 12 seed kind of range. And so I think these next 2-3 games to me are the ones where we either kind of find out that maybe Indiana is in that sort of middle class in the Big Ten, and that would still be an outstanding season, 8, 9, 10 wins, some really memorable moments, whatever, or is Indiana genuinely one of the 3 or 4 best teams in the conference, and therefore should it be in the playoff conversation deep into November? I think we get that answer in the next 2 or 3 weeks.
Zach, if you can figure out some of those teams in the Big Ten, the Iowas, Wisconsins of the world, USC, hey, let us know. But it's been that kind of year. We appreciate it, trying to put a finger on what really makes Indiana tick. That's great stuff. But thanks for your time on the pod.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Ryan, he was awesome. But one thing that really stands out to me is the end of that conversation. All I can think about is, you know what? It's already a good year for Indiana football. 8, 9, 10 wins, great season. But what we're really going to find out is it a great season, or is it one of those Cinderella runs, once in a generation, once in a program type years for Indiana? And what does that do for the bar moving forward? And I think that really is like, they're not going to drop off to where, oh my God, they lost 5 or 6 of their, they're not going to lose 5 of their last 6. But is it a great year? We're one of those, oh my God, wow, Indiana's 11-1. They're like the season that no one saw coming type year.
You're 100% right. And this is like the time to prove it. Zach is right. Like, they've not played anybody. To their credit, they've done what good teams are supposed to do to this point. You beat down the bad teams, right? They've left no doubt. Every game has been decided by at least 14 points. So they're not playing down to their competition. For the most part, they're pulling away early. Some games, if it's close, they'll pull away late. Like, they've done a great job at handling their own business to this point. Like you said, second half of the year, started with Nebraska, Washington, Michigan, Ohio State. There is no, even Michigan State, there's no easy game left on the schedule for the Hoosiers. You will really see now what this team is made of, but they have, at least for me sitting here, they have given no reason to doubt their ability to beat every team, let's say outside of Ohio State, with how they've looked so far and taking care of business the first 6 games.
Yeah, and let's get into our picks, and obviously we'll start with that game. It's Indiana at noon hosting Nebraska. It's an Indiana team that hasn't faced adversity this year. That's the one thing I'm still looking to learn about this team that just oozes of confidence. They've scored first in every game. They haven't trailed. They're one of 2 teams, right? Texas, I think, is the other one that hasn't trailed this year. 4 games and 500 plus total yards of offense. Running game's been good. Passing game's been good. As Zach talked about, they've been on schedule. If they get adversity, how do they handle it? But because of that point of them being at home, and it's going to be a sold-out crowd, places going to be fired up, I don't think they're going to have to face adversity in this game. I think they score early. I think it's a tight game. I think it's maybe a little bit more low scoring because those are the games Nebraska's played, the limit possessions. But Nebraska has shown that they can make some mistakes, and Indiana hasn't shown that yet this season. I like the Hoosiers. I like the Hoosiers to cover the 6.5. I like them, especially because they're at home in this game, to keep things going. A big part of their success, though, will be finding balance on offense. I'm not saying they're going to run wild against Nebraska, but they need to find a way for Justice Elson and Tyson Lawton to at least be productive in some elements and stay balanced and stay ahead of the chains with that run game. It doesn't have to be explosive, but not everything can fall on Curtis Rourke, but I like them at home.
I think the run game is going to be really tough for Indiana because, like, you look at Nebraska, that's their strength, their defense, right? They are a tremendous rush defense. They're 7th in the country in terms of rushing yards allowed per game. They're the only team trip in the country that has yet to allow a rushing touchdown on the year. So they have been so stout on that side of the ball. But what you said, a little bit what Zach said as well, I love the efficiency of Indiana's offense. Even if they do become one-dimensional in this game, I trust Curtis Rourke to make enough plays right now more than I do Dylan Raiola. And I know Zach had questions about, hey, if they get to 30, they'll be good. But if it's a lower scoring game, can Indiana win those kind of games? I think they do. I think this is a tight game, like you said, lower scoring. I say 24-20. I think Indiana wins. I think Nebraska covers the almost 7-point spread. I think, though, Indiana at home gets a gritty win, their first true win of the year. Cignetti is tough. He's not all finesse. I think he does bring a lot of that substance as well. So I'm not worried about a grinded out game not going Indiana's way. Close game, 24-20. I think Indiana wins. Ugly, close. I think they really show you something coming out of this game that they're not just a great story. They are for real when it comes to college world playoff contention.
Let's go through some of these others a little bit more quickly here. Nothing screams welcome to the Big Ten for number 2 Oregon. Then a short week. You played Saturday night late. Now you got to fly all the way to Indiana to take on what's a bad Purdue team that just put up 46 points after halftime last week against Illinois in a Friday night affair on Fox. Oregon, 27.5-point favorites. Like, this is your really learn about the Big Ten moment for Oregon. I love the Ducks in the game. I think they're equipped to handle it. I don't think they get too high after the Ohio State win. I just think they have way too much talent. I like them being locked in, maybe a little sluggish early, but ultimately they take care of business.
They win the game. Well, I'm not going to get crazy here. This is not going to be Iowa from a few years ago or Ohio State from a few years ago where number 2 goes to die against Purdue. Oregon's winning. I think this can be at least the spread, 27.5 points. I think Purdue can cover that number in part because, like you said, it's a short week. You're coming off such a high. And look, college football coaches try to say it all the time, like, we'll be locked in. We're not going to let that, previous results impact us. You're 18 to 22-year-old kids. It's natural coming off that insane high of beating Ohio State the way they did. I can't see them being totally focused on Purdue. And Ryan Brown, he's going to start this week, rightfully so, gave Purdue some real life here against Illinois, 297 passing yards against the Illini, also added 118 rushing yards, 3 touchdowns. First quarterback for Purdue since Brandon Kirsch, 2002, 22 years to have 250 passing yards and 100 rushing yards in a game. He's dynamic. I think he can make a play or two to, again, keep this within 4 scores. So I think Oregon wins pretty handily here, but like by a 24-point margin, 21-point margin here. So I think Purdue does get the Friday night home cover.
Wisconsin at Northwestern, 12 noon on Big Ten Network. Wisconsin, 7.5-point favorites on the road. Is this the Wisconsin team we saw the last couple of weeks, or is this still the Wisconsin team that we saw to start the season? Walker has been really, really good running the football, but Northwestern's run defense, Xander Mueller, Mac Uline, it's a run defense that's held teams to 87 yards per game and under 3 yards per carry. Jack Lausch has actually played pretty well with the exception of the Washington game. He uses his legs well. I'm going with the Wildcats at home.
Wow, pulling off the upset. This rivalry trip is unbelievable. Going back to 1985, they played 33 times. In all 33 matchups, Wisconsin has been the favorite. But the records, Wisconsin has won 17 games. Northwestern has won 16 games. Throw the Vegas line out. These two teams are basically even no matter what it is. I think we're going to see Wisconsin's offense on Saturday, the same one that we've seen now the last few weeks. Braden Locke has played really well. They're playing at a high level. I don't think what we saw against Purdue, but especially last week against Rutgers, is a fluke. I think they carry that into this game. I think they win. And now I think Northwestern covers. I think this will be a very close game here. I like 27-24. Wisconsin wins on the road, but Northwestern, I think, gives them a real big challenge here. But two teams playing some really good football after starting the year off pretty slow. Let's stay in the noon slate here, Trip. UCLA, another cross-country flight. They're now going to take on Rutgers, another early kick. Rutgers 4.5-point favorites at home. That game on FS1. What you got here?
Well, network executives tried to hide this game from the nation's eyes. I would like, if UCLA didn't play late on Saturday, and I can attest to what that does to your body flying all the way across the country, and they have to do it for the second time in 3 weeks, having been at Penn State. I'm inclined to take UCLA in a real 14-13 type of game. UCLA has failed to score more than 17 points in a game this season. Well, if there's one team that might work against, it's Rutgers. I'm inclined to take them, but I can't because of the second cross-country trip in 3 weeks. I like Rutgers in a game that no one wants to watch at like 17-9.
I would take UCLA if Justin Martin were starting. And maybe he does. I've not seen anything right now to indicate that he will. But the one start, you got a close-up view, Trip. I thought he played well in that game against Penn State. I mean, the offense, again, they only scored 11 points, but I think they did a few things well compared to what you're watching with Ethan Garbers. He can't hold on to the football. He has 9 interceptions, just 4 touchdowns. He's a turnover machine. Like you said, they have not scored 17 points more than one time. I don't know how that's possible. But so make a quarterback change, but it doesn't seem like they will. So give me Rutgers at home. I'm with you, ugly. Give me like 20-10. Rutgers wins, Rutgers covers, but I'm with you. A very forgettable game here at noon on FS1.
Second best game of the weekend, obviously 24th ranked Michigan at 22nd ranked Illinois. Michigan favorites, 3:30 CBS time slot. Over under in this game is 43.5. You know what? I like Illinois. Michigan's too one-dimensional. I think they have flaws. Illinois is at home. They put up 50 points last week. Altmaier hasn't turned it over. I think Illinois wins. I believe in Brett Bielema getting the job done.
I'm with you. And what I can't understand, why is Michigan favored? Like, that's what I'm shocked, to be honest with you. Like, I think this is a bad matchup for the Wolverines. Like you said, Allmaier's been tremendous. And that Michigan pass defense, we talked about it in the last few weeks. We talked about it against the Washington game a few weeks ago. They're one of the worst in the country. They're 110th in the country in terms of passing yards allowed per game. Altmaier, Zakari Franklin, Pat Bryant, like, there is no shortage here of power through the air. I think they'll have a lot of success. I think they'll win this game, even though they don't have Caden Fagan. I still think the passing game will be enough for the Illini to win. And I just don't know, even though Jack Tuttle is now QB1 and did some good things against Washington the last time we saw the Wolverines, I don't think it's enough. Like you mentioned earlier in the pod, like they haven't had a 100-yard passer in a month, Michigan. I don't see how they have enough offensively to keep up with the Illini. I'm with you. Give me Illinois straight up here to pull off the Vegas upset, but I'm surprised here that Illinois is even a home dog.
Michigan's favored in this game against Michigan State and Northwestern. They're already dogs against Oregon, IU, and Ohio State. How many? Michigan's 4-2. How many wins do they finish with? Just real quick.
6. I think they were 6-6.
USC at Maryland, 4 p.m. FS1. USC, right? Even though they got to go across the country. I like Maryland is not playing well. This is probably the end for Mike Locksley in College Park. This is USC.
I agree. No Eric Gentry is out for the year, unfortunately for USC. Stinks. They're all world linebacker.
They should get McCree back, the tight end. He was supposed to play last week and ended up not playing. But with their two back, Woody Marks is as good as any back in the Big Ten. Pair him with Joyner. Their threats at receiver. This could be a high scoring game.
You're right. Let me throw this by really fast here. Coming off the deflating loss to Penn State last week, you're going across the country this week to play a Maryland team. This game has no juice, right? This to me feels like a Lincoln Riley game. If you have control of your program, if you have real belief in your program, I think the great coaches in college football get your guys ready to play no matter what. I would be concerned if I was USC if we watched a deflating game where even if USC wins, but it's a non-spirited effort, I would feel really encouraged if you're a Trojans fan, if they come out and smack Maryland, which they should. And I think they don't. I think that is telling about the belief of Lincoln Riley from this team, at least.
No, completely agree with you on that one. Last one, Michigan State, 3 straight losses, but they've been against BC, Ohio State, and Oregon. They're coming off a bye. Can they slow down the Iowa running game? Do they have a chance at home at night on NBC?
I think they actually pull off the upset. I like Michigan State here. I know on paper this does not look well, like you said. Iowa's running the ball really well, and Aiden Childs turns the ball over, which is a recipe for a disaster against Iowa.
And that's why I'm taking the Hawkeyes.
This to me feels like coming off the bye, Childs can kind of reel everything in. He can make a lot of plays. I think in this game will be the first one where he does a lot more good than bad here. I like Michigan State in a sneaky spot at home, crowd behind them, night game here. I think the Spartans win this game outright.
And I like the Hawkeyes.
All right. That's the smart play here, but hey, we'll have some fun and see what happens. So that'll do it for this edition of Still Enrolled at Big Ten Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in again. Make sure you are subscribing wherever you get your pods and on YouTube as well. Tell your friends. We're having fun here. We're talking Big Ten football. We talked about it at the beginning. This season is wide open, maybe more than it's ever been. Teams are in it. Teams are surprisingly good. It is a good time to talk Big Ten football. We're talking and having a good time talking with to each other about it, but let's talk about it together here. We are one giant college football loving community. Make sure you do tell your friends about us, grow the community here, and let's talk ball a lot more here the last few months of the season. So enjoy the games, enjoy the weekend, have a great weekend. We'll be back with you on Monday to break it all down right here on the Still Enrolled podcast.